Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Evening.
It's been a long time,
Yes, it is.
too long.
Yes.
Hopefully we can continue and the numbers will continue to go down. Let's hope for that. Just a few housekeeping items. First of all, you need to have your parking ticket validated if you parked in the parking garage. So please, if you haven't done so, stop by the front desk and they'll validate it for you. Also, there is a bowl on the table for contributions if you are so inclined. It would be greatly appreciated. And I want to mention that there will be a book signing afterward, right by that contribution bowl. Harry Serio wrote a new book. It's entitled The Mysticism of Ordinary and Extraordinary Experience, with a foreword by Dale Groff, who some of you know who he is. So Harry will be signing this and selling them at a discounted price, normally $23. He'll be selling them for the low, low price of $20 tonight. So. Our purpose is to gather together in a setting where challenging and complex current cultural and religious faith issues are presented, shared, and discussed. We're not here to judge, but rather to create a safe space for significant conversation. Please be respectful of others and of the views that they express. There'll be a presentation of roughly 45 minutes to an hour, and the remainder of our time will be used for questions and comments. Although we want to encourage good discussion, please don't dominate the conversation to a point where others are unable to share their thoughts. Please raise your hand. I don't think it'll be too much of a problem tonight with the few people we have, but we still ask that you raise your hand in case there are more than one. And the microphone will be brought to you, and you may ask your question or make your comment at that time. We believe if we can hold to this format, everyone will leave here enriched. Once again, we want to thank the Doubletree Hotel for their generosity in once again offering this venue. It's offered to us as a great gift for free. And so we're very grateful for that. Please feel free during the program, if you so desire, to head out to the bar area and get a drink. They're kind enough to supply us with someone out there to help our time be enjoyable. So go ahead and do that, and tip your server or whoever's out there well. So I would like to introduce Harry Serio, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
And thank you, Bob. We have to make sure all the recording devices are working, so.
That's good.
It's good to see you here, and hopefully in the future we'll increase and double our numbers. But we're very fortunate to have as a kickoff speaker for this season Reverend Hayden McLean, who is a graduate of Lancaster Theological Seminary and who has not only served in the parish but worked predominantly as a hospital chaplain. And the topic for this evening deals with a lot of the experiences that he's had and the why question that many people in the hospitals ask. You have already received the fact that you're here. You've already received the announcement and the biography of Hayden, and we're very fortunate that he's here and has made the trip from New Holland in Lancaster County, but he has worked at Reading Hospital and has served well there. So without further ado, Hayden.
Harry, have the mic. Just pull it out.
very much to Harry and to the gathering this evening for the invitation to be with you. I'm going to have a lot of material to go over tonight, okay? It's like a 10-pound presentation in a 5-pound bag, okay? Feel free to take notes, that's fine, but if you want to have a concise, clear, easy to understand synopsis of tonight, I would invite you to simply put down your name and email address here, and I will send you all of the material right to your email, and you can have it for your permanent reflection or whatever for 3 easy payments of $39.95. So tonight we're going to be talking about theodicy, and that is justifying the ways of God in a world in which there is suffering and or evil. Suffering and evil are not the same thing. There is some overlap. But what I'd like to do tonight is to address the issue of theodicy in this format. I'd like to talk about a computer program that's operating in our minds. Then I'd like to put up here on the scratch pad the problem, why we in the Judeo-Christian tradition have a problem with suffering and evil in a universe where there's a benevolent and omnipotent God. So we'll see before our eyes what our issue is with it, okay, our cognitive dissonance. Then we'll take a look at some responses to the problem, how people have theologized or interpreted or made sense of the problem. And most of these, you will notice, will come out of the scriptures. And then, I don't know if we'll get this far tonight or not, but I'll make the material available to you by email. There are some untrue Christian cliches that we toss around, okay? They sound nice, but they're just not true. Like, everything happens for a reason. Okay. Boo. Then there are maxims on suffering, some pastoral thoughts on suffering when people go through it, as well as this one. Okay, so that's kind of the outline. So let's talk about the computer program in our mind. Most of us who are familiar with computers know that there are programs running in the background of our computers. As long as they're working and they don't cause a problem, we don't even think of them. We're made aware of them only when they don't work. Well, we have kind of a mental program operating in our minds which helps to create the problem that we're talking about tonight. Okay? If you take a look at a couple of chimpanzees in a cage, and you give one a peanut, do chimpanzees like peanuts? No. And you give the other chimpanzee a grape, do chimpanzees like grapes? Oh, way more than peanuts. So the chimpanzee who got the peanut but didn't get the grape, sometimes they really act out. They scream, they throw the peanut, they won't eat it because they want a grape like the other chimpanzee, okay? So the primates have a sense of equity or fairness or how things should be treated equally, right? And do you know any other creatures on the face of the earth that also have that program running in the back of their minds? Human beings, okay. For instance, one of the first things a young child will learn is looking out in the world. The young children are able to tell when something is equitable or equal or just, and when something isn't. That little 4-year-old knows to protest by saying, hey, that's not fair. Who taught them to say that? Nobody taught them to say that. They're hardwired. And since I was a child once, I guess that means I am too. We are hardwired to know what's fair and what isn't, and what's equal and what isn't. And we don't teach our children how to measure what's fair or not. When they see it, they know it isn't, and they protest it. And we appear to have that same neurology that goes back, I think, 6 or 7 million years, was the time when the chimpanzees and the Homo sapiens branched off as our last common ancestor. So you know that innate sense of fairness goes back a long time. And our children are born with it. And so we have a sense of fairness when we look out at the world, and we don't like it, we get uncomfortable when we see things that are unfair. Now, when we grow up and we become adults, we sometimes will talk about that social cohesiveness. Our phrase is often, if you scratch my back, I'll... Okay, that's called reciprocal altruism. You take care of me, I'll take care of you. Or some people just use the phrase reciprocity. And it's a big part of our social fabric. It's how we relate to each other. If you walk my dog when I'm on vacation, I'll take out your trash when you're on vacation, right? It helps to make the world go round. The reciprocity. I've noticed that we take that reciprocity and we have a tendency, not universally, but there's a tendency in humans to assume that reciprocity exists in our relationship with God. So, if I try to live an ethical life, if I'm a part of a religious group, if I support my religious group with my prayers, my presence, my gifts, and my service, and some of you will know what denomination that comes out of, right? If I try to live that kind of a life and I bring my family along with me, that will make God happy, and in God's reciprocity, God will prosper me, protect me, and take care of my family. Okay? And I've run across a few examples where people made deals with God based on that reciprocity, right? And what happens when the reciprocity ends up not being there? You see, that's our contract with God. But I haven't seen any contract that had God's signature on it, right? We agree to that, okay? But God hasn't agreed to that. Okay? So we look out at the world and we like to live in a world where there's reciprocity, and we assume that there is some reciprocity with God. But we find out in life that sometimes that reciprocity from God is not there. And then we get knocked off balance. So this is what we are experiencing. We're going to put a proposition up here. God is omnipotent. Okay. You seem to be okay with that one, right? Okay. That is, God has the ability to do whatever God wants to do. Right? We can put up a second proposition. God is benevolent. God is good. God desires only what is good for his creation, and especially for us, because we're the crown of creation. So, historically, we have theologized with two propositions. God is omnipotent and God is benevolent. And if these were both true, then we would come to a conclusion that there should be no suffering, because that's not God's nature to do that, and it's within God's power to prevent it from happening. So if proposition 1 or 2 are true, there should be no suffering in this world. Is there suffering in this world? Okay. Therefore, however, suffering exists. Okay? This is not a proposition, this is a fact. Right? We can tell when we're suffering, we can look at somebody else, we can tell when they're suffering, they're in anguish, you got tears, red eyes, we know what that looks like. This is a fact. These are not. These are propositions. This fact overrides these propositions. Therefore, that's what the 3 dots mean. Therefore, God does not exist. Okay? So thank you for your time this evening. Nice to have you. Okay. This is the logical conclusion, is it not? Okay? And there are people who have followed to this logical conclusion. And they use this argument to prove that God does not exist. And that's why they call this the atheistic argument. Okay? Now, if we affirm this proposition and this proposition, but we also acknowledge that suffering exists, we need some kind of glue to hold this all together. And so what we have done in the Judeo-Christian tradition is we have created qualifications. We have said, theologically, yes, God is omnipotent, except, yes, God is benevolent, unless, okay? Does suffering exist? Maybe not. So that's how we have kept the atheistic, that's how we've kept these propositions and this truth of suffering glued together. We have qualified these statements. And a number of them will be familiar to us. I don't know that I'm going to have time this evening to go through all of my footnotes, but you will notice that almost every one of these qualifications is in the scriptures. Okay? There are a number of different qualifications, but you can find almost all of them there. Okay? Which, quite obviously, tells us that the scriptures are not of one voice with this issue. Okay? We're probably familiar with how long it took to write down all the books of the Bible, right? And that some of the material predates the written, okay? So it spans a great expanse of time, and not everybody who wrote anything in the scriptures agreed with everybody else. So you have all these different points of view. So let's take a look at these different points of view and these qualifications. God is omnipotent. is something called dualism. In this universe, there are forces of good and there are forces of evil. And we're very familiar with it. Do you remember the dark side? And may the force be with you in going over to the dark side from Star Wars, okay? The yin and the yang. So God is omnipotent, except there are perpetual struggles between good and evil, and sometimes God comes out on top and sometimes God doesn't. Okay? A constant struggle. We see this often in the movies with, Rambo, Jean-Claude Van Damme, right? The good guys against the evil's forces, etc. Okay? So God is omnipotent, except there are forces working against God in the universe. And those forces restrict God's work. God is omnipotent, except there is a specific individual in this universe called Satan. And Satan is trying to thwart the good that God is trying to bring about. Okay? It's kind of like a personalization of dualism, right? It's good. It's a good God and Satan, and right? Satan tempts us. I remember preaching a sermon on the temptations. And you remember the story when Jesus was tempted? And I said, Satan tempted Jesus to turn the stones into bread. And I said, Jesus should have turned Satan into a loaf of bread. And I would have taken care of the problem. Okay? So Satan is also a force in this universe working against the omnipotence of God. Okay? God is omnipotent, except there are some forces in the natural order that aren't cooperating with God. Okay? Suffering is an unavoidable consequence of natural forces and rhythm operating in the universe. The universe is generally God's good creation, but there are parts of God's creation that aren't working with God. Okay? In other words, the natural order argument says that there is a degree of chance and randomness in this universe, and sometimes things go wrong. Do you know who bought into that position? A fellow by the name of Jesus. Luke 13. Jesus understood suffering to be a natural part of living in this world. Some people came to him and said, Jesus, it goes roughly like this, Jesus, did you hear that Pilate sent his soldiers in to slaughter those people who were at worship? And Jesus said, do you think they were any worse sinners because of the fate that fell on them? He says, no. In other words, Jesus was saying, those soldiers were not the hand of God bringing punishment on those worshipers. Besides, people of worship of all people ought to be protected from those kinds of things. But they weren't. And then Jesus goes on to say, or how about the Tower of Siloam, which it's not there anymore in Jerusalem, it's long gone. But the Tower of Siloam, it fell over and it killed 18 people. Were they any worse sinners than anyone else because that fate fell on them? Jesus says, no. So Jesus seems to be acknowledging that there are some chance or random events that happen and people get hurt or killed or they suffer. But God is not behind those events. Okay? One thing that isn't pointed out very often is when Pilate sent his soldiers in to slaughter the people at worship, that was an act of human will. The Tower of Siloam was up, and one day it just fell over. Why? I don't know, shoddy craftsmanship, the foundation gave way, but it was a different kind of act than Pilate's soldiers. Today we use the terms moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is something that humans do. Natural evil is just an accident of nature. What the insurance company calls an act of God, even though Jesus said it isn't. Okay? But the gist behind Jesus' comments is that neither moral evil nor natural evil is caused by God. They're just part of the natural order, and sometimes things go wrong. God is omnipotent, except God has created humans with freedom, and we have free choice. And sometimes we as humans make poor choices, and we bring suffering upon ourselves or other people. There are several different kinds of free choice sufferings. There are evil events. There is sin. There is fallenness, or what we often call original sin. And there are structures of evil. These are all subtypes under free choice. So God has created us free, and we can make good decisions or we can make bad decisions. And when we make bad decisions, we may cause evil, we may engage in sin, it may be original sin working in us, or it may be some structure of evil in the world like racism, sexism, and all the other isms. Okay? Some people say the American focus on consumerism is one of those structures of evil. Okay? A footnote to original sin. There was a great church father who went back, he took a look at the Garden of Eden story, and he developed a great big theology of original sin. And that was Saint
Aquinas.
Was that
Aquinas?
Augustine?
Well, Augustine, but then
Augustine?
Aquinas
Okay.
came later.
And he developed his understanding of original sin out of the Garden of Eden. One of my old colleagues used to say that the first mistake Adam and Eve made was not eating was not eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was their second mistake. Their first mistake was they should have eaten of the fruit of the tree of life. If they had, we'd all be walking around in our birthday suits and live forever. If you take a look at the story of the Garden of Eden, what do the scriptures say was the sin in that story? Okay. Sin is not mentioned in that story. been some eisegesis. Okay? We've put sin into that story, but it's not mentioned in the Garden of Eden. Does anybody know where sin is mentioned first in the scriptures? Sin is couching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. What story? Cain and Abel. Remember? Cain was jealous of Abel. That's the first place sin shows up in the Bible, which helps us maybe redefine what sin is, if you want to think about redefining it. If you read the Garden of Eden story, sin is disobeying God. But if you read the first place sin shows up in the scriptures, the Cain and Abel story, sin is doing damage to a brother or a sister. So how does that change the foundational understanding of sin, if that's what sin is in the scriptures? Okay, doing damage to another person. So, what we have done is we've taken the omnipotence of God and we have qualified it. God, yes, is omnipotent, except there are forces working against God. There is an entity named Satan who's working against God. Sometimes accidents happen, and sometimes in our free choice we make mistakes. Now, we can also qualify the positions that claim, that adapt the proposition that God is good, that God is benevolent. Despotism. Some people have come to the conclusion that God operates according to God's rules, not ours. That's what a despot is. Okay? So sometimes God may be good, but if God is having a bad day, we may not like God that day. Okay? Do you remember the parable of the woman who came before the judge? In a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. Remember that? That is a despot. The judge made up his own rules as he saw fit. So there are some people who claim perhaps God is despotic too. Not nasty. God is just operating according to God's own rules. Okay? Now, where do we see that in the scriptures? How about the book of Job? Right? Job had some great friends when they came around to console him, and they did a great job as long as they sat in silence. They didn't get in trouble until they started to interpret what was happening to Job. Well, you must have sinned, or you must be getting punished, or you must, okay, all these, God is doing all these things to you because you did something wrong. Okay? So, God kind of comes across as despotic at the end of the book. When Job finally loses his cool and he says to God, I want an explanation. And God says what?
Tough.
Right. I'm God, you're not. I'll ask the questions, you don't. Okay? So we actually have a little bit of despotism applied to God in the scriptures. As another footnote, the book of Job is often described as the book that tries to discern the root cause of suffering. Right? Because that's what all of Job's friends are trying to help him with. This is why you're having a tough time. But somebody looked at the book of Job through kind of like another prism, another facet, and said, maybe that's not what the book of Job is about at all. Maybe the book of Job is asking, what is the character of God? What is the nature of God? What kind of God do we have that allows these kinds of things to come upon a righteous and innocent person? I will leave that to better biblical theologians to answer that. But I think that question is in there. What kind of God do we have that allows something like this to happen to somebody like Job? Okay? God is good, but sometimes we misbehave and God punishes us. Have we ever heard that before? Maybe some of us have thought that before. This is not infrequently used to explain suffering and evil that comes upon humanity. And we understand that suffering and evil are not exactly the same. Suffering is an objective kind of event. We can tell, we know when we're suffering, we can tell in other people if they're suffering. Evil is really a judgment call. It's a value judgment. The 9/11 attacks on the United States, were they evil?
To us.
Not if you were a terrorist. If you were an American, they were evil. If you were a terrorist who had a bone to pick with the Americans, it was a good thing. So you see, evil has within it a value judgment. Okay? This, like I was saying, this is frequently used. We may remember when the HIV virus came out, and a certain Mr. Falwell on television claimed that that virus was God's punishment on a particular segment of our community. Remember that? Anytime somebody else gets whacked, it's because God is punishing them. Now, when they get whacked, it's not that same thing. It's a different reason. But it's a long-standing explanation. Remember the Johnstown flood in western Pennsylvania? How did people interpret that? God's wrath on the West End porn shop. Okay? That's how people interpret it, okay? And sometimes, when, like Harry explained, I've spent some years in hospital chaplaincy, and it's not unusual for people in the hospital to wonder what I did to deserve this, that I'm in the hospital, right? I did something wrong, haven't figured out what it is yet, but I'm sure I did something wrong, right? That's that reciprocity. You recognize it? If I do good, God will reward me. The flip side of the coin is, if something bad happens to me, it must mean I tripped up somewhere, right? That's that reciprocity. Maybe God is testing my faith to see how much I can take, right? And this one is related. I am enduring suffering because it's good for me. It's aiding my personal growth. Right? Paul makes this argument. I think I have a bookmark in here, but I don't want to take the time to look it up. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces, okay, right? That's Paul explaining the purpose of God bringing suffering. It's good for us. Take your castor oil, right? Now, there are a couple of positions that actually redefine evil. We have a partial perspective. My suffering today looks really bad, and I don't like it. But that's only because I'm seeing a slice of the pie. God has something greater that God is working on, and my suffering is temporary, and God is going to bring something much better out of this. Romans 8:28. All things work together for good. Right? We have a partial perspective, and if we can just hang in there, God's going to redeem the situation and bring something good out of it. By the way, this is very common in the Amish community. I've gotten to know a number of Amish families in the hospital when things went wrong, and there is never a word of complaint. Now, sometimes you can see it in their eyes, but they will never protest because everything is God's will. And God is going to bring something good out of this. Now, the question that some people ask is, okay, if God brings something good out of it, will the goodness be worth the suffering? Okay? And some people have come to the conclusion yes, and others have concluded no. But this is very common in the Amish community. If something happens, it's because God made it happen. Therefore, there is no need to complain to God about anything, because God wanted all this to happen just the way it did. Okay? We see a little evidence of that in the scriptures. Book of Lamentations. Right? People protesting God. This isn't fair, this isn't right. Hey, God, you forgot about me. Help me out here, okay? Have you ever noticed there is no Christian book of Lamentations? Why? Because everything that happens is supposed to happen just the way it happens. That's the way God wants it. Why are you going to lament that? It looks bad today, but just give it time. God is going to bring something better out of it. Okay? That's one piece of evidence of how Christian theology has, well, we're seeing evidence of how Christian theology shaped the scriptures, right? There are no Christian laments. Okay. is an illusion. Suffering is an illusion. What denomination is affiliated with this kind of thinking?
Christian Science. Christian Science.
Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy, right? No, there's no suffering in this world. It's just a matter of erroneous thinking. Right? And if we had the right thoughts and we interpreted things right, we would understand that all this suffering doesn't really exist. Because the world that God created is perfect. So there can't be any suffering in the world. Now, of course, the next question to ask is, if everything God created was perfect, then where did erroneous thinking come from? Right? But Mary Baker Eddy was the one that really got this one started and took off in Christian Science. Okay?
Not Scientology? Not Scientology?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Scientology.
Scientology, that's right. Scientology.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Suffering is an illusion. So, these two positions redefine what evil is. Now, there are a couple of additional positions. Atheism. Right from the atheistic argument. There are people who have said, you know what? You say that God is omnipotent, you say God is good, but I see enough suffering, so there can't be a God. Right? And so some people reject God. There is a well-known biblical scholar. Do we know Bart Ehrman? Okay? PhD, Princeton with Bruce Metzger, who chaired the new RSV translation committee. That's where Bart Ehrman got his PhD in New Testament. And I think he was a Baptist. I think he was a Baptist. He grew up in the church. And he teaches at University of North Carolina. Okay, he's written some great books. Bart Ehrman grew up and he said, I know my Christian faith says God is supposed to be omnipotent, God is supposed to be good, but there's no denying there's way too much suffering in this world. So he became an atheist, turned in his ordination, walked away. He still teaches, okay? He's still got his faculty position, but he's an atheist biblical scholar. Okay? And he wrote a book in which he details how he went through this whole process and came out as an atheist. He explains it, and this is the spiritual growing pain he went through. So if you'd like to read the book, it's called God's Problem. I think he should have named his book Ehrman's Problem, because that's who had the problem, right? So there are people who affirm atheism. They just say there can't be a God with suffering, at least not the kind of God you talk about. God may be despotic or whatever, but he can't be good and omnipotent. The last position is, boy, you know, a question like this is just too big for us humans to figure out. It's a mystery. I'm just going to have to go on faith. And, I'm not going to lose sleep trying to figure it out. It's just a mystery. One of my favorite quotes. Remember Woody Allen? Right? He's got kind of a zany sense of humor. He was talking about this issue one time, and he said, I don't think God is malevolent. About the worst you could say is, he's an underachiever. which is kind of, I don't know that I would preach that. But it's, you know, it's his comical way of, you know, taking a look at something religious that's serious. Okay, so that's where we are as far as laying out the basics. Okay? Now, I'm guessing that some of you may have seen yourself with what I put up on the board tonight. Okay? Because I know I'm up on the board. But this is what I've noticed. And, you know, if you want to do a little fun homework, this is what I've noticed in my work. Something unfortunate happens to somebody and they'll say, oh, that Satan is working on me, something terrible. And then sometime later, something unfortunate will happen and they'll say, oh, I know God's testing my faith. And a little later, something unfortunate will happen and they say, I must have done something wrong for God to be punishing me. In other words, they're taking a shotgun approach to the topic. And every time they have to answer the question, they come up with a different answer. Right? Not realizing that they're contradicting what they said last year.
Mm-hmm.
They just grab the first idea that pops into their head. So, if you don't want to do that, and you want to be systematic in coming to some resolution on where you stand with this issue, here's what I would recommend. Take a few minutes with a pad of paper and write down every source of suffering that you can think of. Emotional problems, ill health, early death, you know what I mean? Everything possible. Accidents, okay, acts of God in nature, whatever. Write everything down. And then explain every one of those suffering events under one category. It's not that hard. I had to do it in theology class. Okay? If we don't come up with a systematic way of looking at this, then every time the issue crops up, we're going to grab for the first answer that pops into our mind. Right? Now, there are some people, I know one of them. One of them was a teacher of mine, and he rejected theodicy completely. He would not accept whitewashing God or taking God off the hook because he saw one particular kind of suffering that just shook him to the bones every time he ran across it, and none of these qualifications satisfied him. And so, every time he ran across this particular situation, he started to write his own Christian laments, and he would shake his fist at the universe. And that event was the suffering of innocent children. No excuses. He never took God off the hook for that. There is no excuse for it and no justifying that happening in this universe. So he rejected this whole theodicy on that one point. So, pastorally, I would have this to say, like probably old hat to some people. When a person says, "Why is this happening to me?" the last thing you want to do is answer their question. Okay? Right? For a few reasons. Number one, you could be wrong. Number two, it's maybe your reason, but it may not work for somebody else. But the rule of thumb is, when people ask us these questions, they don't want our answers. They want our help finding their own answers. Okay? And every once in a while in chaplaincy, I would trip up on this. You know, somebody would say, "Why is this happening to me?" And I'd say, "Well, you know, because blah, blah, blah." And you know what they would do? They'd ask the question again. And then I go, "Oh yeah, I shouldn't have answered the question." So when somebody says, "Why is this happening to me?" it helps to reflect that back in a more pastoral response. Has anything like this ever happened to you before? When you were in a situation like this before, what did you find helpful? Or, "I'm not sure why this is happening to you. What do you think?" Okay? And reflect it back and help the other person to find their own answer. And my experience is people can usually find their own answer. And I've needed to find my own answers in life. But one thing I found about myself is when I found an answer, I didn't always stay there. Sometimes I evolved. And I realized, oh, my thinking was incomplete. And so I would need to move on. And other people do that too. They will need to think things through and come up with what works for them. The other thing I've noticed, and I've seen this in my life, but I've seen it in other people. And if you'd like to read a very kind pastoral book on this, there's a book out there by Nancy Burns, B-E-R-N-S, who used to teach sociology at a university. Her book was Closure. Okay? What we do in life to try to bring closure. And she talked about the different kinds of things that we do to bring closure. When there's a death, we have a funeral, right? When we have a divorce, we bury the wedding rings, or, you know, whatever. And Nancy Burns kind of said in her words what my experience was. Sometimes there are things that happen to us, and we want to think through and interpret them and find meaning in our suffering. And even on those occasions when we come to some kind of resolution as to why this has happened to me, we still recognize that even though I understand why it happened to me, it still wasn't right. In fact, I said at dinner tonight, You know, I lost my father when he was 53, I was 22. I did a lot of thinking about that for a long time and finally came up with an explanation. He died when he was 53 because he got sick. That's why, okay? So even though I came to a resolution about it, nevertheless, it still wasn't right. And sometimes things happen to us in life, and the best thing we can do is try to find a way to live with them. Because, as Nancy Burns points out in her book, closure is a myth. It doesn't exist. We can go through the motions and we can reach for it, but it never really happens. And that's when helpful pastoral response comes in. Okay? So that's the Odyssey in a nutshell. The atheistic argument and the 12 ways that we qualify the propositions and the conclusions in order to make the atheistic argument hang together so we can both hold on to our suffering and hold on to God at the same time. Except for people like Bart Ehrman, who let God go. Okay? I'm going to stop here and give a few minutes for questions or comments across the room. They don't have to be addressed to me. But very briefly, untrue Christian cliches, if anybody would like a copy of this. When God opens a door, when God closes a door, he opens a window. Heard that one? Okay, everything happens for a reason. God won't give you more than you can handle. Okay? You don't want to use that one on a behavioral health unit. Right? Not a good idea. Here's a piece that I will make available by email. Maxims on Suffering. This is from Cornell Rempel, who used to be at Phil Haven Hospital in Mount Gretna. Are we familiar with that? It's a behavioral health hospital. He has several, and I find them very pastoral and helpful. Suffering is not God's desire for us, but occurs in the process of life. Suffering is not given in order to teach us something, but through it we learn. Okay? And then I have a sheet on pastoral responses. If any of you anticipate being asked, why is this happening to me? There's some practice questions that you can kind of work on, okay? Okay, sure.
Yes. Okay, I'm on. One of the very difficult times in my ministry was to try to help the wife of the man who was dying with throat cancer. And she was sure that this was God's response to some sin that he had conducted. And I don't really remember how I got through that, but I remember her response, that she was absolutely sure that this was the result of sin. And what to do with that when that happens.
Yeah, okay. What I would try to do is peel it back like an onion. Do you have any idea what sin may have been so bad that God would do this? Okay, kind of peel it back and help the person think about what the person is claiming. And sometimes people, that's the way they exit the world. They're not going to let go of that. But pastorally, we can help them ask some questions about that.
we got here. Microphone, remember? There's a classic book, forgive me for the title, I didn't make it, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And it tackles the idea of how do you find meaning. He talked about the Holocaust, he experienced the Holocaust, and how was he going to find meaning in all of this. The first half of the book explains his experiences. The second half of the book, he's a psychiatrist, so he kind of tackles what happened. So it's a very interesting book to read if you haven't read it.
I think I have a quote by Viktor Frankl on the bottom of one of these sheets. Man is not destroyed by suffering. He is destroyed by suffering without meaning. Meaning.
Okay.
Right, just hold it
Right.
just like that.
Okay. Now, I'm not a minister or a counselor or therapist. So I'm just thinking some of my reactions. First of all, in the Old Testament, God gave us the 10 Commandments. So a lot of suffering happens because people break those commandments. And then I understood, I mean, I'm no Old Testament scholar either, but I was told that when he told them what to eat and what they couldn't eat, like which animals they could eat and which they couldn't, I was told that was because at that period of time and the way they prepared food, if they would have eaten what God said they shouldn't, they would have become ill. Now, I don't know if that's true. And then the other thing is the Sermon on the Mount and Beatitudes. I mean, a lot of suffering happens because people don't follow those or embrace those. So I don't see that God is giving, punishing us. It's what the choices we make.
Did you want to answer that, or do you want
No, I wanted
to
to,
speak right into that?
I wanted to answer the man down there that asked the question about a funeral. I come from a very large family, and we have a lot of funerals, and we always say to other people that God has a place for them, and that's why he took them away. It's his plan, not ours. His will be done.
Just an aside, I remember reading about a very religious soldier during World War II. And he was one of those people that first came into one of these concentration camps, and he saw all this horror. And he said, you know what? He said, if there's a God and he allows this, I don't want him. And he never went to church or Sunday school or anything after that. It was just too much for him.
One of the stories that I'm familiar with coming out of the war, and this is that reciprocity. A fellow went off to World War II. He said, God, you get me home in one piece, and I will be in church every Sunday for the rest of my life. And he did. He got home without a scratch. And he was in church every single Sunday for the rest of his life. Even when they got a pastor he couldn't stand. Okay, this is true. He went down the street until the pastor got moved, and then he went back. Okay, but he was in church until he could barely walk. And so he interpreted that as God rewarding him, okay, he would reciprocate. If God would take care of him, he would reciprocate. But it's a cognitive bias. It's the survivorship bias. How many other GIs tried to make the same agreement and never made it home? So only those who survived could tell that story. Right? The ones that are buried over in France can't tell that story. Right?
I'm going through this aging process is how people actually transcend their suffering. And I'm experiencing that now as I'm volunteering at the senior center in Pottstown. I see people that have lost, children, spouses. I see it with a blind person there. Oftentimes, that person is more full of life than some people that have much more to be, happy about. You see it in, there's a documentary that's airing on the PBS channels now about the Holocaust for whatever reason. And how those people survived that torture. I don't know there's any way to really describe it, but they've come out of that and they've lived lives. They've married, they've raised children. So there's an element to all of this suffering that my suffering that might bother me doesn't mean anything in terms of perspective. I'm just trying to raise a point, that's all. I look at it.
Yeah, and I've seen that
It's
too.
amazing.
I've seen people in the hospital who were in just miserable shape.
Right.
And they'll say, boy, you must see the guy across the hall. I'm thinking, ooh. Okay? I've also run across this. A fella who was pretty sick, and he didn't feel well in his sickness. But he talked about offering it to God. And I tried to reflect back. So you see your suffering as redemptive. You are giving a gift to God in your suffering. And he bursts into tears. You never know how people make meaning out of their own suffering. And we see some of that in the suffering servant in Isaiah, right? Suffering for somebody else. Viktor Frankl, he found that the people who got out of themselves and tried to take care of other people because somebody had an extra morsel of bread, they were the ones who did better in the concentration camps.
Just amazing.
I was really clear on what I wanted to say, and now I got a little bit messed up. But I think one of the challenges that we all have as people of various faiths is trying to understand God. Like, I'll just be really clear that my understanding as a believer and then as a pastor and as a seminary student, I think we had some classes together. Has changed and grown, and at least I think it has. And lately, I'm not so much talking about God as I'm more that God is about love, and God's coming down into the midst of incarnational theology, and what we believe that God comes into the midst of our messy stables. Keep it. That's where am I looking for God? Am I looking for God like way up there, omnipotent, all-powerful, way up there, the master, puppeteer, that kind of thing? That's not where I am right now, but that God is, where is God? Much more like right here inside me in this fellowship and looking at this and stuff. I'm not saying Steve is God, no. I know you want to claim that. Yeah. But
I think it was Ken Pargament. Do we know Ken Pargament? He was in charge of the PhD program, I think at Bowling Green. He was a clinical psychologist, but did a lot of work in psychology, religion, and spirituality, and he wrote a great book, if you don't mind reading something thick, The Psychology of Religion and Coping. Psychologically, how do people use religion to cope with the challenges in life? It's a great book, and I think it's Ken Pargament who says, the operative question is not whether there is a God, but whether God is mad. Because there are a lot of people who think God is just mad at them.
There's a great book called A Cry of Absence. Martin Marty wrote it back in the mid-'80s after his wife died of cancer, I think fairly young. And to me, it's one of the best books about grief and loss I've ever read. I don't know if it's in print anymore because I keep buying them and loaning them out and I'm not getting them back and then trying to buy them again and I can't find them. But for me, part of the problem is the way we are taught to misinterpret scripture from a very young age. The way we are taught that, nothing will make me crazier than someone talking about praying for traveling mercies, right? A bubble will surround you and you'll get home safe, but others might not. I think that exceptionalism we have that we're taught is dangerous and infantile, because then we think we should never die or suffer. But that's one thing we all have in common, is we all have loss, we all suffer. It's not a punishment, it's just who we are as people.
It's not really a question or anything, I just thought, just thinking as Steve was talking, for me right now, it's important to remember, I think a lot of what we're saying is seeing God as distant from us. And, why is God as some entity separate from us, in charge of or in control of the suffering? And I think we forget that this is also, I forget, this is also a God who did something, right? At least if you're in the Christian faith, right? This is a God who did grieve, so that doesn't answer any questions, right? But it just in some way does give me comfort. And oftentimes my pastoral response is typically, I don't know, but I believe God is here with us in this. Because, and that's really maybe an honest, and you've all been there, especially when you're looking at, 108 and 9-year-olds who are burying their friend. And all you can say sometimes is, this sucks, right? And they understand that, and God did not do this. And what grievous sin could a 9-year-old have committed, but I believe God is here with us through this, and this is a God that, in our story, experienced this with their son. And in that, there's an experience that we're experiencing with God, not, I think that's more, just in relationship with God, not really as a separate entity.
There's a bunch of cliches, and I'm sure you got this one in there. When our son Andy got in a car accident coming home from work one day, and one of the leaders of the church actually approached me with a smile on her face and said, it's great that Andy is now a flower in God's garden. Well, yeah, it does. It's like, I was too numb to say anything other than, I really don't believe that. I guess it comforts this gal. At the same time, when Andy died, we did have a funeral. No, it never brings closure. It was, 1989. It was 30 years ago. There's not closure. However, it was helpful, and that's one of the things that I do remember showed up. People of all different connections that we had over the years. And, the church was overflowing, and it was just overflowing with people, overflowing with love. And, some of the things that, so there's something there, that's what I'm having on with.
Thank you very much, Hayden, for addressing some very critical questions that a lot of people are asking and pondering in their lives. And we want to thank you for bringing this to our attention. And just as Steve mentioned, that this will be available on YouTube at some point, so we'll be able to see this again. So thank you. Bob mentioned Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and I was thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche's quote that if you can endure the why of existence, you can put up with any how. I'm not quite sure that that's operational or it works, but the matter of suffering is a major theme in most of the world's religions. And we've seen that not only in Christianity, but also in Judaism, the suffering people. And we've seen that in Islam. And of course, in Buddhism, the first noble truth is that suffering exists. And Buddhists believe that suffering is caused to a major extent by desire. And whether it's a desire for happiness or some sort of desire. So really, this question of suffering is an important one, and thank you so much for bringing this to our attention again. Just a reminder that next month, our Spirit on Tap will be on February 15th. It's not the fourth Tuesday, but the third. We are very grateful for the Doubletree providing space, but we have to adhere to their schedule as well. So next month it will be on the 15th, and Dr. Greg Carey from Lancaster Seminary will address the question of understanding Christian nationalism. Please sign the form there if you're not receiving emails. If you are receiving our emails about the program, it's not necessary to sign it. This is not an attendance form, but it's just a sign-up sheet for it. And also, your contributions are extraordinarily needed at this point, because we've gone 2 years and we've had expenses, and the treasury is somewhat depleted. So we appreciate any contributions you can make. And anybody else have any questions or any comments? Yes.
When you put out your email, and once you get this up on YouTube, could you put the YouTube address in the email so that we can go back and check it?
Steve will get that to me, and I'll put that on there. So, okay, anything else? Bob?
Harry, usually tell people, make sure your email is legible,
Yes.
so that he can read it.
If you don't get it, that's because I can't get it. So, anybody want a copy of my book, I'll be available in the back here. So, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.